The HMS Starling bucked against North Atlantic swells at 03:47 hours on December 17, 1941. Her Azdic dome pinging methodically through 400 feet of black water, 190 miles west of Liverpool. Petty Officer Frederick Walker crouched in the cramped depth-charge magazine, his welding torch reflecting orange off the brass depth valves he wasn't supposed to be touching. The ship rolled hard to starboard, sending him sprawling against a rack of Mark 7 depth charges, each cylinder packed with 290 pounds of amatol explosive, set to detonate at 150 feet, the Royal Navy's standard setting since 1918. Walker's hands, scarred from 15 years of shipyard work in Portsmouth, moved with the certainty of a man who understood pressure vessels better than any officer with a navigation degree. He was resetting the hydrostatic pistols to 50 feet, a modification so dangerous that Commander Donald McIntyre had threatened him with court-martial 3 times in the past month. "Contact bearing 270, range 1,200 yards. The Azdic operator's voice crackled through the voice pipe above Walker's head. The familiar metallic ping, ping, ping of sonar echoes accelerated as HMS Starling's twin screws churned the destroyer up to 28 knots. Walker finished tightening the last valve with a 14-inch wrench, his knuckles white. The modification had taken 47 minutes. 47 minutes during which the Type 7C U-boat they'd been tracking could dive to 750 feet, turn 90 degrees, and vanish into the thermal layers that made Azdic useless. Standard Royal Navy doctrine called for maintaining course and speed when contact was lost, dropping charges in a diamond pattern calculated for submarines that behaved like they did in 1917. But German commanders in 1941 didn't maintain course. They crash-dived the second they heard propeller cavitation, executing radical maneuvers that rendered carefully calculated drop patterns as useful as throwing rocks at shadows. Walker had discovered this pattern 3 weeks earlier, not through tactical briefings or intelligence reports, but by doing what welders do. He'd listened. During 8 Atlantic crossings, as a temporary specialist assigned to HMS Starling's damage control team, he'd noticed that every time they lost Azdic contact at 800 yards, the subsequent depth charge attacks yielded nothing but dead fish and empty water. The mathematics bothered him the way a poorly welded seam bothered him, the kind of imperfection you could feel in your bones before the pressure test proved you right. A Type 7 U-boat traveling at 6 knots submerged and executing a 90-degree turn covered 200 yards in 30 seconds. Exactly the blind time between Azdic loss and weapon release. Standard depth charge settings of 150 and 300 feet were designed for Great War submarines with maximum operating depths of 200 feet. Not the new generation of German boats that could dive to depths where pressure alone could crush a man's skull like an eggshell. The solution was simple, Walker had argued to Commander McIntyre over lukewarm tea in the wardroom 5 days after their 4th failed U-boat contact. Set 40% of the charges to 50 feet, 40% to 100 feet, and only 20% to 200 feet. Catch the bastards during their crash dive, in the first 15 seconds when they're most vulnerable, when their bows are angled down at 45 degrees and they're passing through shallow water at maximum mechanical stress. The commander had stared at him like he'd suggested setting the charges to detonate inside Starling's own hull. Your modification places depth charges in the surface layer, where our own propellers operate, Commander Stevens, the weapons specialist, had said with the kind of condescension reserved for enlisted men who forgot their place. "You're risking the attacking ship." Walker had done the math on the back of a requisition form. The charges detonated 200 yards astern, and Starling's propellers were forward and 15 feet below the waterline. The blast danger was theoretical. The U-boat kills were practical. But the Admiralty had other ideas. When McIntyre forwarded Walker's proposal through official channels in October 1941, it disappeared into the bureaucratic machinery of Western Approaches Command and emerged 2 weeks later as a terse memorandum. Depth charge modifications unauthorized, standard doctrine maintained, deviations subject to disciplinary action. Translation: keep quiet, follow orders, and stop pretending you understand naval warfare better than officers who'd spent their careers studying it. Walker had watched 6 more U-boats escape in November alone, listening to the familiar pattern: contact at 1,200 yards, acceleration to attack speed, ASDIC loss at 400 yards, blind weapon release, nothing but seawater and shattered fish rising to the surface. Every failed attack meant another convoy slaughtered, another 40 merchant vessels sent to the bottom with cargoes of food, ammunition, aircraft, and the 300-man crews who served them. So Walker had stopped asking permission. The brass depth valves he'd been modifying for the past 3 hours came from damaged depth charges slated for disposal. Technically, he was salvaging components, not modifying operational weapons. Technically, Commander McIntyre didn't know what was happening in his own depth charge magazine at 0347 hours, while he stood on the bridge calculating intercept angles. Technically, if this worked, Walker would be a hero. If it failed, he'd spend the rest of the war in Portsmouth Naval Prison, assuming the blast didn't kill him first. "Range 800 yards and closing," the ASDIC operator reported, his voice tight with the anticipation that came before every attack run. This was the moment when German commanders heard the distinctive thrash of British destroyer propellers and slammed their dive planes to maximum angle, when electric motors screamed and hull plates groaned, and 44 men held their breath as their boat plunged toward the safety of deep water. Walker gripped a stanchion as Starling rolled through a turn, her deck tilting 15 degrees to port. Above his head, the depth charge rails were loaded with 8 charges set to his modified depths, unauthorized and unrecorded. He'd painted small white dots on the modified valves so the deck crew wouldn't notice the difference in the darkness. "Contact lost," the ASDIC operator announced at 0351 hours, and Walker felt the familiar sinking sensation of opportunities slipping away. But this time was different. This time, Commander McIntyre didn't maintain standard course and speed. He'd been listening to Walker's theories during the long night watches, absorbing the enlisted man's observations with the kind of pragmatism that separated commanders who survived from commanders who followed doctrine into oblivion. "Hard to starboard! Maintain 28 knots!" McIntyre's voice carried through the voice pipe, and Starling's hull shuddered as her rudder bit water. They weren't following the geometric pattern anymore. They were following mathematics, physics, and the instinct of a welder who understood that pressure and timing mattered more than regulations. "Release depth charges," McIntyre ordered at 0352 hours, and Walker felt the distinctive thump, thump, thump as 8 cylinders rolled off the stern rails. He counted in his head: 1001, 1002, 1003. At 6 seconds, traveling at 9.6 feet per second, the charges reached 50 feet. The explosion came at 6.2 seconds, a massive concussion that lifted Starling's stern and sent Walker sprawling across the magazine deck. The blast was wrong, too close, too violent, nothing like the muffled underwater detonations he'd experienced in previous attacks. Commander Stevens had been right about one thing. Setting charges to 50 feet meant detonating them dangerously close to the attacking vessel. But Walker was smiling when he picked himself up off the deck, because he could hear something else through the subsiding roar. The unmistakable screech of tearing metal, the groan of collapsing pressure hull, the sound of 750 tons of German engineering coming apart at the seams. "Secondary explosion!" the ASDIG operator shouted, his voice cracking with excitement. "Debris rising! Oil slick confirmed! Contact lost! Contact destroyed!" The second blast came at 03:53 hours, the distinctive crump of a U-boat's battery compartment flooding and short-circuiting, sending hydrogen gas exploding through ruptured hull sections. Walker climbed the ladder to the deck and emerged into the freezing Atlantic dawn to see the evidence spreading across 200 yards of ocean. Diesel oil, thick enough to walk on, wooden debris, life jackets, and the unmistakable smell of electrical fire mixed with seawater. HMS Starling had just scored her first confirmed U-boat kill in 8 months of Atlantic patrols, and she'd done it with a modification that officially didn't exist. Commander McIntyre descended from the bridge at 04:07 hours, his face carefully neutral as he approached Walker on the stern deck. "Petty officer," he said quietly, his words barely audible over the wind and the cheering of the depth charge crew. "What you did tonight was unauthorized, dangerous, and completely against standing orders." Walker stood at attention, preparing for the reprimand, possibly the arrest. McIntyre's expression didn't change. "And you're going to teach every man in this magazine how to make those modifications by the end of this watch." The U-boat they'd killed was U-434, a Type 6TC boat commanded by Kapitänleutnant Wolfgang Hader, 29 years old, veteran of 8 war patrols. She'd been stalking convoy HG-76, which consisted of 32 merchant vessels carrying 14,000 tons of ammunition, 8,000 tons of aircraft components, and 2,100 military personnel bound for Britain. If U-434 had reached attack position, estimates suggested she could have sunk 6 to 8 vessels before diving away. Call it 40,000 tons of shipping and 200 to 300 lives. Instead, she was settling onto the ocean floor at 1,847 feet, taking her 44-man crew with her. Walker's unauthorized modification had just saved more lives in 6 seconds than most sailors saved in entire careers. But the real fight was just beginning. Because while Commander McIntyre understood the value of Walker's innovation, the Admiralty had very different ideas about enlisted men who modified weapons systems without authorization. And when word of HMS Starling's kill reached Western Approach's command on December 18, 1941, it triggered a bureaucratic battle that would last 2 years, cost hundreds of merchant marine lives, and nearly court-martial the man who'd figured out how to win the Battle of the Atlantic. Walker didn't know any of this at 04:15 hours on December 17, 1941, as he stood on HMS Starling's stern deck, watching oil from U-434 spread across the North Atlantic. He was thinking about the next convoy, the next U-boat, and the 47 other brass valves in the depth charge magazine that needed modifying before sunrise. The war didn't care about regulations. The war cared about results. And Walker, a 38-year-old welder from Portsmouth who'd never fired a gun in anger, had just figured out how to kill submarines more effectively than any admiral in the Royal Navy. The radio message from Western Approach's command arrived at 09:23 hours. HMS Starling to proceed Liverpool immediately. Commander McIntyre report for debriefing. Depth charge modifications suspended pending investigation. Walker was ordered confined to ship, his tools confiscated, his modifications classified as unauthorized ordnance tampering subject to disciplinary review. The kill was confirmed, the innovation was banned, and somewhere in the North Atlantic, 47 German U-boats continued hunting convoys with standard depth charges set to 150 and 300 feet, depths they'd learned to avoid months ago. This is the story of how one man's simple mechanical adjustment, changing a valve setting that cost less than £2 in materials, eventually saved an estimated 4,200 Allied sailors and sank 47 U-boats. But first, it would have to survive 2 years of official rejection, 3 courts of inquiry, and the rigid certainty of military bureaucracy that couldn't accept that a shipyard welder might understand submarine warfare better than officers trained at Dartmouth Naval College. December 17, 1941, was the day Frederick Walker proved his modification worked. The next 700 days would determine whether the Royal Navy would let him save lives with it or court-martial him for trying. The interrogation room in Liverpool smelled of damp wool, coal dust, and cold tea, a mix that clung to the walls the way North Atlantic salt clung to steel plates. 2 hours after stepping off HMS Starling, Petty Officer Frederick Walker sat in a straight-backed chair under a buzzing 60-watt bulb, his hands resting on a scarred oak table that had seen 20 years of court-martials. Across from him, a lieutenant commander from Western Approaches tapped a pencil against a manila folder marked HG-76 U-434 Ordnance. The tapping was precise, 1 tap every 2 seconds, like an impatient metronome counting down to someone's career ending. Walker had faced 300-bar steam lines, 400-degree furnace doors, and welding arcs hot enough to melt through inch-thick armor plate. But this was a different kind of pressure. Here, a wrong sentence didn't rupture steel, it ruptured futures. "You admit," the lieutenant commander said, "that you altered the factory-certified settings on 24 Mark 7 depth-charge pistols without written authorization." His voice was clipped, every word trimmed of excess like a regulation haircut. Walker nodded once. The file in front of the officer contained exact numbers: 8 charges set to 50 feet, 8 to 100 feet, 8 left at the regulation 150 to 300 foot pattern, modified over approximately 180 minutes in a poorly lit magazine, while HMS Starling pounded into 4-meter seas. "And you further admit," the officer continued, "that you did this after being explicitly informed by Admiralty Directive number 241/41 that no modifications to depth settings were permitted." Another nod. The math was simple. The regulations were clear. The dead U-boat on the bottom at 1,847 feet didn't appear anywhere in the charge sheet. What was the distance of HMS Starling from the explosion at 50 feet? A second officer asked from the corner, a commander with torpedo specialist badges on his sleeve. Walker answered without hesitation. "Approximately 220 to 240 yards astern, sir, at the moment of detonation." The commander scribbled numbers on a pad. 50 feet depth, 220 yards horizontal, 290 pounds of amatol, shockwave radius, structural tolerance of a river-class destroyer's stern plating. Walker tracked the figures in his head automatically, the way he had tracked bead lines in weld seams for 15 years. There was a margin of safety, not generous, just enough. That just enough was the space where 44 Germans had died, and 2,100 men on 32 ships had lived. "What you did," the lieutenant commander said finally, "worked. No one disputes that U-434 was destroyed. But if we permit every welder and mechanic to improvise with live ordnance, we'll lose more ships to our own weapons than to the enemy's." That was the heart of it. Not malice, not stupidity, fear of chaos. Walker understood. In a civilian yard, a bad weld on one boiler could take out 15 men. On a destroyer, a bad depth setting could take out 150. Yet the numbers wouldn't leave his brain. In 8 months of standard doctrine, Starling had dropped over 180 charges and confirmed 0 kills. With one unauthorized modification, 8 charges in a staggered 50, 100, 150-foot ladder had produced 1 kill in 6 seconds. He wasn't gambling, the Admiralty was. By 17:30 hours that same day, Walker was back aboard HMS Starling under what the written order called limited duty, which meant he could perform repairs but not touch any depth pistols, fuses or valves. 3 days later, convoy ON-52 sailed from Liverpool with 43 merchant ships and 5 escorts, and not a single one of those escorts carried a formally sanctioned 50-foot charge. Out on the Grand Banks, 2,000 kilometers west of Ireland, 3 Type 7 U-boats and 1 Type 9 cut into the convoy like wolves into a cattle line, sinking 11 ships in 6 hours. The escorts dropped over 90 depth charges, set between 150 and 300 feet. None of the submarines were destroyed. The after-action report ran to 27 pages of coordinates, headings, and depth estimates. Somewhere in the stack, one subparagraph noted, "No detonations at shallow depth observed. All attacks conducted per standard pattern." Word of Walker's stunt spread faster than official memoranda. Sailors talked. Signalmen compared notes across mess tables, and ASDIC operators swapped stories over tea in drafty huts. Within 2 weeks, officers on 3 separate escorts had quietly requested that select pistols be checked by an experienced welder from Starling. The requests never made it to the paperwork stage. They came as muttered questions on shared piers, as quick glances toward the dockyard bar at 2100 hours. "You the bloke who blew that U-boat at 50 feet? One Canadian lieutenant asked him in early January 1942, his breath steaming in the -2-degree night. "We've got 12 Mark 7s that behave like drunks. Think you could, straighten their valves?" Officially, Walker said no. Unofficially, by the end of that night, 12 pistols on HMCS Skeena had fresh internal marks. Small scratches at the 50-foot and 100-foot positions that only a man who'd filed them would recognize. The second test came on January 29, 1942, in seas so rough that 5-meter waves were breaking green across Skeena's forecastle. At 03:12 hours, a Type 7B slid in toward convoy HX-171 at 5 knots, periscope depth, 800 yards off the starboard beam of a 7,200-ton tanker laden with 10,000 tons of aviation fuel. The ASDIC trace wavered, then sharpened. Range 1,100 yards, bearing 085, depth 60 feet, and descending. The convoy commodore's orders were explicit: maintain standard patterns, no experimental ordnance. Schooner's captain, Commander James Grant, stared at the glowing screen for 3 seconds too long, thinking not about orders, but about the unofficial conversation he'd had with Walker beside a coil of 3-inch hawser. "They dive shallow first," Walker had said. "Catch them in the first 20 seconds. Think of it like hitting a rivet before the plate cools." Grant broke protocol. "Pattern Bravo 3, he ordered, a pattern that did not exist in any manual. 4 charges went over the stern, set to 50 feet, 4 to 100, 4 left at a respectable 200. The first 4 detonated at 7 seconds. The shock wave hammered Schooner's stern, scattering crockery in the galley and knocking 2 men off their feet at the depth charge rails. At 8.5 seconds, the 100-foot set boomed. Then the 200-foot pattern rolled out like distant thunder. The ASDIC operator shouted over the noise. "Breakup noise! Multiple hull failures, sir! Strong oil return! Debris coming up!" Through spray and darkness, lookouts watched black objects bob to the surface: wooden planks, a shattered lifebuoy, and then bodies in grey uniforms. Schooner had just killed U-131 in under a minute, using a pattern that, per Admiralty doctrine, did not exist. The report from HX-171 reached Liverpool in 72 hours. The kill was celebrated. The method was buried under vague phrasing. Modified depth charge setting procedure, details attached in classified annex. When Walker requested access to the annex during a brief stop in port, a clerk with ink-stained fingers shook his head. "Technical details restricted to commissioned officers, Petty Officer." The restriction was almost comic. The hands that had cut the new settings into the brass weren't cleared to read about them. The enemy noticed before the Admiralty acknowledged anything. In March 1942, a decrypted German signal from Befehlshaber der Unterseeboote warned of increasingly shallow depth charge explosions during initial attack runs in Western Approach's sectors, advising U-boat captains to dive more steeply and reach 120 meters, approximately 400 feet, within 50 seconds of detection. The order referenced 3 recent incidents in which boats had suffered severe damage at depths previously considered safe, with one boat, later identified as U-581, lost with all 43 hands after being hit at an estimated 25 meters during its crash dive. German engineers recalculated optimum crash dive curves. Instead of leveling at 80 meters, they pushed for 120. That change altered dive times by 10 to 15 seconds and increased stress on hulls and internal fixtures, a mechanical penalty paid in worn seals, leaking valves, and crew fatigue. Walker read none of those decrypts. What he did see were the physical consequences arriving in dry docks. U-boat wreckage brought in on the decks of trawlers, buckled plates showing blast signatures far higher up the hull than 1918-era assumptions, cracked periscope housings that looked like they'd been hit while still in the upper 10 meters of water. In April 1942, he walked around the twisted remains of a salvaged conning tower section from a boat sunk near Iceland. The steel was peeled back like a tin can at exactly the level he would have expected from a 50 to 60-foot detonation. How deep did they think they were? He asked a dockside intelligence officer. "Safe," the man said shortly. "Safe enough to keep using old charts." The bureaucratic reversal began with numbers, not stories. By mid-1942, Western Approaches plotted every U-boat contact, every attack, every confirmed kill or probable. On convoys where captains had, sometimes quietly, sometimes openly, adopted shallow first patterns, the kill-per-attack ratio climbed from roughly 3% to nearly 9%. On convoys that stuck rigidly to 150 to 300-foot settings, the ratio hovered at 2 to 3%. Over a 6-month window, that difference meant the sinking of an additional 12 to 15 U-boats and the survival of perhaps 80 to 100 merchant ships. If each ship carried crews averaging 40 to 50 men, simple multiplication suggested 3,200 to 5,000 lives retained above water rather than scattered across the Atlantic in orange and grey lifebelts. A June 1942 internal memorandum, later declassified, summarized it with math instead of adjectives. Escorts employing modified multi-depth patterns, inclusive of shallow settings, less than 100 feet, show a 2.7 times improvement in confirmed kills per 100 charges expended compared to escorts employing standard patterns only. The memo did not use Walker's name. It called the practice field-adapted hydrostatic staging. Somewhere between the magazine of HMS Starling and a typewriter at Western Approaches, a Welder'S hunch had become a statistic and therefore respectable. Recognition for Walker came sideways. In August 1942, he was ordered to attend a technical consultation at a training base in Tobermory, Scotland. Expecting another reprimand, he arrived with grease under his nails and welding burns on his forearms. Instead, he found himself in a room with 4 lieutenant commanders, 1 Royal Canadian Navy gunnery officer, and a chalkboard already marked with depth curves, attack angles, and columns of 3-digit figures. "Petty officer," the senior officer said, "we'd like you to walk us through the practical limits of pistol adjustment under combat conditions." For 3 hours, Walker described wrench sizes, thread tolerances, hydrostatic spring calibration ranges, and how many pistols a 2-man team could realistically reset in a 4-hour window at sea while the ship rolled through 20 degrees. He broke it down into numbers: 2 minutes per pistol, 30 pistols per hour for an experienced pair, 120 pistols for a full destroyer loadout in 4 hours, provided the sea state stayed below force 6. When he finished, one of the Canadians whistled low. "For the cost of what, 15 quid in replacement springs and valves? We've been throwing away thousands of pounds in fuel and charges, not to mention ships." Another officer did rough arithmetic on the side of the board. A Mark 7 depth charge cost roughly £70 in explosive, casing, and mechanisms. A 50-foot setting adjustment cost pence in labour and negligible extra wear. A single saved tanker could carry cargo worth millions of pounds and enough aviation fuel to keep a fighter group flying for weeks. It was lopsided economics written in chalk and oil-stained fingerprints. The official compromise came in September 1942 as Admiralty Order 745/42. The directive authorized limited experimental use of shallow depth settings, 50 and 75 feet, on no more than 25% of charges in any given pattern, subject to commanding officer discretion and proper recording. It was cautious to the point of timidity, wrapped in language about avoiding undue risk to attacking vessels. Yet between the lines, the shift was visible. What had been grounds for a court-martial 9 months earlier was now doctrine, albeit hedged. Walker received a typed copy via his captain, along with a brief verbal note. "Your valves are now legal, petty officer. Try not to blow us up." No medal, no commendation, just permission to keep doing what he'd already proved worked. The next 93 days turned the paper order into bloody fact. From October to December 1942, escorts operating out of Liverpool, Greenock and Halifax sank at least 7 U-boats in attacks where after-action reports explicitly mentioned shallow presets or Stage 1 detonations at 50 to 100 feet. One of those kills came from HMS Vanquisher, a destroyer whose gunnery officer had watched Skinner's performance and copied Grant's unofficial Bravo 3 pattern, this time setting fully half his charges to 50 feet. In a nighttime action against U-595 in November, his first 4 shallow charges detonated so close that Vanquisher's stern plating bulged inward 3 millimeters along a 4-meter section, requiring 3 days of bracing and welding afterward. The captain accepted the damage with a tight-lipped nod. "We'll fix steel," he told his engineer. "We can't fix dead convoys." German doctrine strained to adjust. Radio messages from U-boat flotilla headquarters in Lorient and Nazaire instructed captains to vary crash dive profiles, recommend descending below 150 meters whenever possible, and warned that enemy charges now detonate unpredictably at all depths. In practice, that meant more time spent at risky, shallow depths at the start of dives and higher structural stresses over repeated patrols. By mid-1943, some boats were being forced home after just 2 or 3 convoy attacks due to accumulated mechanical issues, leaking main ballast valves, hairline cracks in pressure hull frames, and instrumentation knocked out of calibration by repeated close, shallow explosions. A single 50-foot detonation that did not kill could still push a U-boat 10 to 15% closer to failure on its next engagement. For Walker personally, the consequences were quieter. He remained a petty officer, never rising to warrant or commission, despite multiple recommendations from captains who had sailed with him. His file still contained the original unauthorized tampering notation, reduced but not erased by later annotations. Technical innovation contributed materially to increased ASW effectiveness. He spent the remaining war years doing exactly what he had always done, crawling through double-bottom tanks with a torch, adjusting valves in dark magazines, teaching younger welders how to feel the difference between a good thread and one about to strip under load. On some nights, he stood at the stern when charges went over, counting under his breath to the now familiar sequence. 6 seconds, shallow. 10 seconds, mid. 13, deep. Each pattern was a stack of probabilities, cost in steel and flesh, expressed in seconds and meters. By the time the U-boat threat in the North Atlantic effectively collapsed in late 1943, thanks to a combination of long-range aircraft, improved radar, HF-DF direction finding, and convoy tactics, the humble depth charge valve adjustment had become just one tool among many. Statisticians later estimated that shallow first patterns and multi-depth staging were directly involved in perhaps 40 to 60 U-boat kills across 1942 to 1943, out of roughly 780 boats lost during the war. That might sound small until those numbers were converted into convoys, not massacred. If each of those 40 to 60 kills prevented even one successful attack spree of 3 to 5 merchantmen, that meant 150 to 300 ships kept afloat. At average crew sizes, that translated to somewhere between 6,000 and 12,000 sailors and merchant seamen who reached port instead of vanishing into cold water. Even conservative estimates that credited only a fraction of those outcomes to valve staging still circled back to thousands of men. In peacetime, the innovation ossified into procedure. Post-war anti-submarine manuals in the early 1950s included neat diagrams of laddered depth charge patterns, complete with recommended percentages at 50, 100, and 150 feet for various submarine classes and conditions. The text spoke of lessons of the late Atlantic phase, as if those lessons had descended fully formed from the Admiralty, rather than been scratched into brass by a welder in a heaving magazine at 0347 hours. Training films described shallow settings as standard best practice, giving no hint of the months when using them could have ended a man's career. In newer navies, NATO allies, who received British doctrine in thick binders, the story of how those numbers had been discovered rarely came attached. Walker went back to civilian life in Portsmouth in 1946. He took a job at the same yard where he'd started at 17, this time welding merchant hulls for peacetime trade. The orbits of his days shrank from Atlantic charts to slipways and lunch breaks measured in 20-minute segments. To younger welders, he was just Fred, the guy who'd worked on destroyers and complained about sloppy work. Every now and then, a ship came in with depth charge racks still fitted, now dormant, rusting quietly beside polished brass nameplates. Walker would run a hand over the steel and feel an echo of vibration in his bones, the remembered shock of a shallow blast traveling up through boot soles, the 6-second gap between release and detonation that had once decided whether 4,000 tons of steel stayed afloat. He received no medals specifically for his depth charge work. His campaign ribbons matched thousands of other ratings who'd served in the Atlantic. The 1939-45 Star, the Atlantic Star, the War Medal. In the late 1950s, a naval historian writing an article on convoy HG-76 visited Portsmouth and tracked him down in a pub 400 meters from the dock gate. Over 2 pints, the historian took notes on beer-stained paper as Walker described valves, wrenches, and that first unauthorized kill. "You know," the historian said, "some estimates say adjustments like yours helped save over 4,000 men." Walker shrugged. "If the valves held and the charges went off where they were meant to, that's what mattered. We build things to work. That's all." The physics had been simple all along. Pressure increases by roughly 1 atmosphere every 10 meters of seawater. Hydrostatic pistols respond to that pressure. A spring compressed 3 millimeters more or less changes a detonation point by tens of feet. The danger was real. Detonate too shallow, and the blast could tear open your own stern. Set too deep, and the target slipped through the upper layers unscathed. In that narrow vertical band between 15 and 35 meters, a welder's adjustment converted math and metal into lives saved or lost. Mechanical advantage, not in gears or levers, but in meters and seconds. In the end, the legacy of Walker's forbidden adjustment lived not in speeches or plaques, but in procedures. Every later generation of anti-submarine warfare officers learned to think in layered patterns, to assume enemy submarines would change depth rapidly, and to fire weapons in spreads that covered from the surface down. Rocket-thrown hedgehog projectors and later homing torpedoes replaced simple cylinders rolling off rails. But the underlying logic remained. Do not trust doctrine frozen in an old war. Trust what steel and water are telling you in this one. That logic began the night a 38-year-old welder looked at a brass valve marked 150 feet, thought about a boat sliding past 50 feet in the dark, and decided that the factory setting was wrong. The Battle of the Atlantic is often summarized in tonnage and tallies. 2,700 merchant ships sunk, 14.5 million gross registered tons lost, 36,000 merchant sailors dead, 30,000 U-boat crewmen never returning. Within those numbers hides a smaller count. The U-boats that never managed a second attack because something went off too soon and too close for them to survive. Among the many inventions and machines that turned the tide, radar sets, Huff-Duff arrays, escort carriers, Lee lights, sat a cheap brass valve, adjusted by hand with a wrench that cost less than a shilling. It did not look like a weapon. It looked like a plumbing part. Yet, in its 3-centimeter stroke, in that tiny mechanical decision to move detonation points upward by 30 or 60 feet, thousands of tons of shipping and thousands of men's lives pivoted. Most histories will never name Petty Officer Frederick Walker or list depth charge staging pioneer beside admirals and strategists. The paperwork that might have recorded his role was stamped routine and filed in boxes that no one opened for decades. But every time an escort commander ordered, "Set the first pattern shallow," and every time a submarine died in the first 15 seconds of its dive instead of vanishing into the deep, a line could be traced back to a man in a pitching magazine who chose to turn a valve against orders. In a war often remembered for grand strategies and famous generals, one of its quiet turning points began with a wrench, a spring, and a 50-foot gamble that paid off in oil slicks and empty sea where convoys kept moving.